Welcome to the Aviation Safety Community Podcast, presented by the Aviation Safety Community and today's sponsor, FlightLogix. Dedicated to progressing aviation safety, leadership, training, and research in the air and on the ground. In this week's episode, Grenville Hudson interviews Simon Hooper, Head Underwriter at Precision Autonomy, regarding the future of unmanned vehicles in the aviation industry.
Welcome to the Aviation Safety Community Podcast. I'm Grenville Hudson, and I have with me Simon Hooper, who works for a company called Precision Autonomy, where he is the head underwriter. G'day, Simon. How are you going?
Fantastic, Grenville. Thanks for inviting me onto the podcast.
No worries. No, it's great to have you involved, and I think you've got some very interesting things to talk about in the area of unpiloted vehicles or drones, and I think there's a lot of lessons that we're going to learn out of this in terms of safety management. So, Simon, would you like to just give us a bit of background of what you're doing and what you've been doing, just so as we can get ourselves orientated?
Yeah, no problem. So, Precision Autonomy there's two parts to our company. We're actually a software company, and we provide what we call sort of next generation risk management software to insurance companies today. So that's probably the bigger part of the business. And then the other side, we run an underwriting agency here in Australasia, where we underwrite drones or unmanned aircraft systems, or whatever you want to call them, whatever the customers are calling them. Really, we just call them drones at PA. Personally, myself, I look after the product more broadly on the software side. So I have two roles: head of product and head of underwriting. So head of product means that I sort of help design the actual software that goes into the system and how that sort of works, all the what we call the algorithms and all the mathematical magic that sits behind the scenes. And then on the underwriting agency side, I look after the actual acquisition of new business and managing the actual business on a day-to-day basis. So just making sure that we're looking after a couple of key insurance metrics like loss ratio, and we're just going to talk a little bit about sort of what constitutes an accident and from an RPAS perspective, and how we can learn from that, and what the aviation community needs to keep an eye out for in the next few years.
Okay, so yeah, that sounds really good. In terms of the next 12 months, what are the hot topics as far as safety and drones are concerned?
Well, the hot topic today, right now, is beyond line of sight. When we think about drones, a lot of people immediately think about very small toys that you buy from JB Hi-Fi or Harvey Norman. That's certainly the case and has been the case for the past sort of 5 to 10 years. But that's actually not what drones are about, and that's not where the technology is heading. And beyond line of sight is really where we're going to see a lot of the capability for drones really come into its own. We've seen the payload, which is the reason why you fly the drone. So similar to an aviation, you're obviously trying to use an aircraft for a specific purpose. In the unmanned aircraft space, you're using a drone for a specific purpose, and that purpose is the payload that sits on board. Those payloads are now pretty incredible, and now the actual drone itself is quite automated and can do things and get to places that traditional aircraft cannot, at a price point which is nowhere near the cost of normal aviation.
And in terms of how close they can get to things too, it's quite different, isn't it, really, when you look at it?
Absolutely.
Helicopter or just a fixed wing operation. Yeah,
absolutely. So like the common example, we need to think about drones in distinctively two different lights: the very small operations, which is like small drones doing dull, dirty, and dangerous ops. And then we have a look at the much bigger sort of long-range drones. But we'll just focus on the small stuff today without getting too complex, and probably because we can use some really tangible scenarios, like in beyond line of sight world. These drones can be used to go underground and fly sort of in a mine and inspect the mine before sending people down there. There's a specific drone called an Ilios that does that, and it's widely used now in the mining industry, and it's a fantastic risk mitigation for preventing, putting a human in harm's way. Pretty boring job to send a drone down there and have a look, but hugely effective to be able to assess a mine shaft before actually sending a human in there and potentially making them face something that they shouldn't be facing.
Yes. Yeah. And what else? Where would we typically see other applications of this type of technology?
Yeah, so I think in the next 12 months, if we just focus on beyond line of sight,
yep.
And just to define for the listeners what beyond line of sight means, it effectively means that you can have the remote pilot sitting in Melbourne and operating a drone in the Pilbara or in Western Australia. So that's just to give some clarity around what I mean by beyond line of sight. I think what we can really start to see is a lot more what I would call linear asset inspection work. So a lot more sort of drones worth $40,000 to $50,000 inspecting train lines, inspecting power lines, inspecting various different sort of high value assets in remote locations. And once they've kind of demonstrated that that's quite a very, you can do it on a high repetitious and reduce the amount of sort of human activity at those remote locations, we'll start to see them operate in much closer confines to the larger city centres particularly around Sydney and Melbourne, where we have some really expensive assets that do need to be regularly inspected and are currently done with humans around them. Think telecommunication towers, power plants, those type of assets that can be done using drones. And it's all about just having the right person inspecting it. And that's where the beyond line of sight comes into its own, because you can have the pilot sitting anywhere in the world, really. You don't need to have them at the location of the actual operation.
Right. And in terms of safety aspects relating to operation of drones in these environments, like there's obviously risks associated with the drones not functioning correctly or losing power in some way. How do we manage all those sorts of things?
Yeah, so drone operators need to be thinking about three distinctively different areas of risk: the technology risk, the human risk, and the operational risk. And I place them in that order because it's a really important order. So the technology risk is really important. Something that we take for granted in aviation is the level of safety that we get from airworthiness standards and other aspects of, basically aircraft crashing and resulting in a very high standard of manufacturing. You just don't get the same level of manufacturing in drones. So the technology risk is significantly higher. So depending on what you're trying to do with a specific drone, you really need to be thinking about what's the best tool for the job, what's the best drone. And if you are going to use a cheaper drone, think about whether or not you need a backup or a backup to a backup, because these aircraft do crash a lot more than a traditional aircraft does. Our stats kind of indicate about 1 in 40, 1 in 50 drones crash. And when they do crash, they're usually harmless, like they don't do any damage to anything else, but they usually are unrepairable. So it's something worth considering. So the second part would be the human component, which is, it's funny that we talk about drones and autonomy, but a vast majority of the claims that we do experience are due to really poor planning from the pilot. So I wouldn't necessarily say they're the cause of loss, but putting a drone up, particularly late in the afternoon, has resulted in a number of claims for us here as an underwriter, and those generally occur because the pilots are operating much longer duty times than they would in a traditional aviation environment, working sort of 10 to 12 hours a day. And I like to kind of use a very basic scenario, and there's think about standing in your backyard and just staring up at the sun for 8 hours a day and see how you feel after doing that. Some pilots are doing that for 10 hours a day. So at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, maybe it's time not to put a drone up because you might be a little bit fatigued or dehydrated.
And the third thing that you said
was the operation itself. So it's a really critical part of the risk, and that is, what are you doing with the drone? So if you're doing power line inspection work, sort of what I would call the job specific risks around that type of operation are really important to factor in. Because if you're doing power line inspection work, you do have some electromagnetic interference you need to consider, which would not be apparent if you're doing real estate photography. Drones aren't, again, coming back to that technology risk, drones aren't manufactured to the same level as a normal aircraft or a normal aviation product. So we need to be thinking about, okay, if I'm flying this hobby grade drone worth $2,500, how's that going to sort of act and respond around a very powerful power line? It may not do what you expect it to do, and sometimes the unexpected is it might go at full throttle directly into the ground. So that's a very real thing that we've seen a number of times.
Right. So I guess one of the things that would concern a lot of people is that, drones are going to get bigger. There's no doubt about it, and their lifting capacity will be quite significant because they're talking about using them for doing reasonably major freight runs and things like that.
Yep.
But the laws of physics always apply. So as things get bigger, the weight of the actual aircraft itself increases. I guess the amount of energy it will release when it crashes gets bigger.
Yep, exactly right.
Yeah. So where do you see that going?
I termed this a while ago. I call it the war on drones, and it's basically a war between minimization, which is where you can do something with a smaller drone, the same outcome that a normal general aviation aircraft is trying to do with a smaller drone, or you automate a traditional general aviation aircraft to not require a pilot to be on board. So you can do one or the other. And if you actually look at the military, that's kind of what they do. They kind of have either really small drones or they're looking to automate their much larger aircraft. And one of the things we might want to consider is, like, let's look at the fires that we had January a year ago, where we had the Herc that unfortunately crashed. Why does a pilot need to be on a Herc doing firebombing exercises? Like, the technology is there that you can automate any aircraft just about to do those type of operations. We call them OPVs, optionally piloted vehicles. So if you've got passengers on board, yes, put a pilot on board. But if you've got no passengers on board and they're flying into a very restricted airspace, why do you need to have a pilot on board? Just let the thing fly itself and put the remote pilot back at the forward operating base and let them fly it from there. The Herc crashes. Yes, it's a tremendous economic loss, but at least there's no lives lost in that scenario. So I think that the real question, Grenville, is not necessarily whether or not a drone is going to grow in size, but whether or not automation is going to get to a point in time where traditional aviation aircraft can be retrofitted with, to make them optionally piloted, which is, I think, probably a more realistic scenario, just because of the value of the current general aviation assets out there in the market.
Yeah, and this is sort of like the forerunner would be like the one single pilot operation instead of a multi-crew operation.
Exactly. Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. Exactly right. So I think that's the next step for airlines as well, even, is where you turn a 737 into an optionally piloted vehicle, so an OPV, and where the second pilot, the second in command, is actually a remote pilot on the ground, and that they have one pilot in the air, and then another 25 years goes by, and then we finally go, all right, we don't need to have any pilots on the ground, but we still want to have we don't need any pilots in the air, but we still want to have two on the ground. And then potentially it's the next development after that would be to have one pilot looking after multiple aircraft, which is hard to think about, but I think it's a realistic scenario at some point in time in the future.
Yeah. So just talking about the future, and let's finish on this note. Where do you see, the next 10 to 20 years, the future of drones and what they'll be doing?
Yeah. So I think COVID-19 has probably accelerated a lot of drone activity, particularly with passenger transport. The risk of getting on an aircraft and contracting something similar to COVID-19 in the future is material. And so I think a lot more people are going to be thinking, why would I bother going to an airport and getting on a 737 and flying to Sydney when I can just go out to, out the front, get on an aircraft, get on what we call an eVTOL, and just go to another destination near Sydney I'm the only person on that eVTOL, which is a very realistic outcome. So I think that could be in the next 10 to 15 years. There is significant investment in that at the moment, like Boeing or Airbus. Don't quote me on this, but you can go Google it. Have just committed to like a multi-billion-dollar deal to purchase a whole bunch of these types of assets as a part of sort of leveraging away from more traditional airline business. And then if we look at the other side of the coin is, and everyone talks about it, is the delivery. So Amazon doing drone delivery, maybe not necessarily residentially. I think that'd be the 10 plus year, but sort of the 5+ year for drone delivery will be commercial delivery, which is like basically taking assets from a centralized location at Australia Post to more outposts so they can send them as a hub and spoke model. And then you would still get that final 1 mile delivery via a more traditional method. I just think it's going to be hard to teach the broader population to accept a drone delivery at this point in time. But as we start to sort of grow and develop as a society, we'll start to accept those modes of delivery more readily. But in the meantime, I think businesses will move towards using that as it's just way more effective and way safer.
Yes, and in terms of like the safety side of things, where do you think the biggest risks will come? Is it still in the line of those 3 areas that you described, or will the balance go from technology to people, or what do you think?
No, I think what will happen is the technology risk will reduce tremendously. I think the human risk will probably stay fairly static because the bulk of our human risk is it revolves around planning and preparation. Where we will find is the operational risk will increase over time because drones are going to be more widely used and the barrier to entry is going to reduce. So we'll see, more people doing more of it. And the entry level, when I say the entry level is reduced, it costs a lot of money to buy an aircraft today, whereas you can buy a drone for a lot less. So you're going to have a lot more pilots doing a lot more activity than you would in a general aviation environment. So I think what the biggest threat really is the operational side, and that is that we're really giving aviation to everyone. Everyone's going to be able to access aviation. You don't necessarily need to be specially trained to be an aviator in the next sort of 20 years.
So where do you think, just quickly, the regulatory side of things, not just in Australia but around the world, where do you see that now? Has it caught up? Is it ahead of the game? What do you think?
Yeah, so it definitely hasn't caught up. The problem that the regulators constantly have is that that they can't keep up. So when they finally do keep up, we just seen this recently. So CASA, I would argue that CASA has finally caught up here in Australia. And then over Easter, they released some guidance material around beyond line of sight. And so what happens is, as soon as they release guidance material, all the operators out there immediately start to invest in beyond line of sight technology. And then they have this plethora of operational. So CAS has this plethora of questions about, I want to do this, and immediately they realize, oh wow, we're not prepared for that, and the floodgates have opened again. So I think that the regulators are doing well to manage what they can, but I also think that potentially there could be a scenario where an association of sorts could assist a regulator to more effectively administer the system until it's grown to a point where it needs to be handed back, only because associations are much more aligned to what the realistic scenarios are out there, and the regulators kind of get caught up with a bit of a bit of a funding problem from the federal government, particularly here in Australia. And looking abroad, the FAA are doing a good job, but again, they're really only solving the who is flying issue, not necessarily the what are you doing with it issue, which is a big problem.
Yeah. Well, Simon, look, this has been really, really fascinating, and thank you very much for coming on the podcast. Look forward to talking to you again in the near future, because I think this is just something that's just going to become more and more important from an aviation perspective. But once again, thank you very much for being part of this.
Excellent. Thanks, Granville, for the invitation. And I'd love to come back on if the opportunity arose. All the best.
Cheers, mate. Bye.
We would like to thank our sponsor for this episode, FlightLogix, for their continued support throughout this podcast's production. FlightLogix, providing low-cost aviation safety department solutions.
Thanks for listening to this episode. Be sure to like and subscribe if you liked our content, and if you're interested in learning more, feel free to find us at aviationsafetycommunity.com.au, or if you wish to continue watching, have a browse of our YouTube channel to find some more episodes and content.